workshop. And Elena Tobin is my co-host, and she is going to be fielding questions from you. And if you have any other questions about anything, just type them into that chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But I do want to thank you all again for joining me today. And I think this should help a lot of you. This is going to be dealing strictly with the overlock side of our machines. We're not going to be doing anything in cover stitch mode. But before we get started, just a few things that I want to mention. Again, make sure you're on mute. But also, I am running a little special on my book, Serger Essentials, this one. If you purchase that, if you don't already own it, it's a great little book for reference and for information. And I have a free ship on that till the 31st of May. And you can just use the free ship code on that. And also, I have a 10% off my Serger tote bag pattern, and we'll put a picture up of that too. And I can just quickly show you one that I have done. I've made a few of them, and I'm working on another one with some kind of cool variations on it. But that also, I think the code for that is Memorial Day, Elena?
Yep. And we'll have slides at the end too with the picture, and we'll email everybody at the end with the recording link and a little handout and just a little special.
So as I said, we are going to be dealing with the overlock side of this. I also want to say that if anyone hasn't subscribed to my Serger tip clips on YouTube, please do. That gives you a lot of information on tips and techniques. And if you have a question about anything on your machine, if you're using a different machine than I am, I'll be very happy to help you along with that. And the same goes for this morning. I do want to mention that all of my slides are done on the Baby Lock Ovation. However, this is good information for all brands and models of machines, because all of the components in the machine that we'll be focusing on are pretty much the same from one machine to another. They may look slightly different, that the way you adjust different things will be different from one machine to another. However, if you have your instruction manual in front of you and your machine nearby, that will help you identify where things are. But if you have a question about anything, just type it in. Or if you think of something after we're all done, you can always shoot me an email at gail@gailpatrice.com. So I think we're ready to get started. So we have our little agenda. It's going to be the Serger overview, and then we're going to do Decode the Stitch, and we will stop periodically. I had said to Elena when we were formatting this, please, if I start rambling on and don't stop and ask for questions, don't hesitate to jump in. But she was smart and put in some question slides. So I think we're all set to go. Can everybody hear me okay? Is everything good on that? Okay, great. All righty. So this is going to be, let's get to know our Serger a little bit. And I'm going to try to minimize this box a little bit. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Then I can see the full slide. So let's take whoops, let me come back here. We're going to take a look at the full machine right now, because I'm going to be talking about some different things. I think somebody's not on mute. Just be sure everybody's on mute. Okay. So let's look at it. And these are some of the components that you have on any brand or model of machine. Now, the machine you're looking at is a combination overlock and cover stitch machine. And if you have a 4-thread serger, you won't see these many spool pins on the back of your machine. But all of you do have a telescoping antenna arm right up here. And I like to start with my tour of the machine right at the top. Just make sure your telescope arm on your machine is fully extended and that it's firmly into that base, the table where your serger cones are going to rest. Just make sure it's nice and secure.
Oh, I totally give up.
Oh, somebody's not muted. So you just want to make sure that telescope arm is fully extended, because that does affect the way the thread feeds as well as the tension. Now, on the back, again, you have spool pins for your serger cones. I guess I should say cone pins. But if you want to use all-purpose thread, like if you don't have 8 million different colors of your serger cone thread, you can certainly use all-purpose thread on spools. Just take off these little cone holders on the spool pin. Get that on. And most machines come with little spool caps that you can put on top of the cap, and that allows the thread to feed off and not get hung up on any little either slits that they have to hold the thread on your spool, or any little irregularities that might hang it up. Also, while we're looking at this, most of your machines have a little door on the lower left that forms that part of the bed, and that usually will swing open. And on some machines, that is the way you are going to either move your knife or disengage it. Also, your stitch finger. So that door is right down here. So, and we have a few other things here that we'll look at up close too. So let's go to our next one. Now on my machine, I do not have traditional tension knobs or dials. They have what's called a stitch selector, and these auto set the tensions. However, on your machines, you may have tension knobs and dials that are aligned with your left and right needle and your upper and lower loopers. And most machines will have a shaded area that will tell you this is the normal setting or the neutral setting on the tension for that. And it's just like a little good visual guide for you to know about. Some machines have speed control. Not all of them do, and it's not absolutely necessary. You can certainly control the speed with your foot control, just like the accelerator on your car. But the one thing that's nice about speed control is that if you're doing some kind of a fussy specialty technique, you can slow it down by sliding the little lever over toward the left and slowing it down. Or if you're teaching somebody who's new to serging and you don't want the machine to kind of run away with them, because sergers stitch at a relatively high speed, you can slow that down as well. But is it necessary for all work? Absolutely not. On this machine, here is my differential feed setting. And again, if you've never adjusted your differential feed from 1 or N, you'll want to look in your manual for how to adjust that, because differential feed is really one of the nicest features on a serger that a sewing machine does not have. And again, on my machine, N is the equivalent of a differential feed setting of 1 on many machines. I know some brands use N and some use 1. They are the exact same thing. And we'll talk about how that works. Basically, with differential feed, as you go up to say 1.3, 1.5, all the way up to 2, that is, as far as I know, on every single machine, the highest setting that you can go up to. But you can also drop the differential feed below 1 or N. And the difference in differential feed is that you have 2 sets of feed dogs under the presser foot as opposed to just one on your sewing machine. And differential feed allows you to change the speed of the front feed dogs. The back feed dogs always, always, always remain constant, no matter what your differential feed setting is. The higher your setting goes above 1 or N, the faster the front feed dogs are going. And that's something that's very handy if you're working on a stretchy fabric like a knit, or an unstable grain line, say a bias grain line on a woven fabric. But there are lots of times when you might want to slow down your differential feed. And when you lower that, you're slowing down those front feed dogs. And what that does, it's almost the equivalent of taut sewing when you're holding your fabric from the front and back of the feed, front and back of the presser foot on your sewing machine. Like a lot of times when you're using thin, lightweight knit, not knits, but thin, lightweight woven fabrics like chiffons or that type of thing, you hold them from the front and back so that you don't get puckering. And when you lower that differential feed, that will basically do the same thing. And we can talk more about differential feed in much more detail in a full day or 2-day workshop. Now, this machine also has air threading for the loopers, and the Baby Lock company had the patent on this for many, many years. However, about 4 or 5 years ago, that patent ran out. Now, I believe almost every brand on the market has air threading. I know Juki does, Janome does, Bernina, Baby Lock still has theirs, and I believe I know they all have an air threading ports on their machine. And if by chance you're in the market for a new serger, I strongly advise you to look at those, and because it makes threading those loopers a breeze, and no pun intended on that. But the air threading is so wonderful because that threading, especially of the lower looper, tends to be the big hang up with a lot of people. And if you have the air threading, super easy, and you don't have to thread in any particular order. If you have a 4-thread serger, you just have the 2 ports for your upper and lower looper. As I said, this is a combo machine, so I have a 3rd one with the chain looper. And you might not have a lever like this and a push to thread button. You may have a lever that you push down on once the thread is in the threading port itself, and that kind of whooshes and pumps the air and pulls the thread through to the eye of the looper. So again, if you're thinking about a new machine, no matter what brand you're looking at, ask if they have one with air threading. And it's so helpful, especially if you've got any manual dexterity limitations, say from arthritis or anything, or visual ones. Very helpful. So it's a good feature to think about. I'm sure you all know where your presser foot lever is. Mine happens to be on the front of the machine, out on the ovation. They have actually changed that position to the upper right side of the machine on the newest Triumph. But many of you have it where it's right in back of where your presser foot is, kind of like your sewing machine. Some of them have them on the upper right, and some are on the upper left. They're kind of all over the place on different makes and models, but that's just the presser foot lever that raises and lowers the presser foot. Some of you may also have a machine that has a knee lift, and that's very handy too. And if I know there are some sewers that would never even buy a sewing machine without a knee lift because they're so accustomed to it. And that's just a matter of personal preference and what you're used to using. But there are some sergers that also have that feature. Now, this is something that a lot of people might not even realize they have on their machines. And this is why I asked you today to have your instruction manual, your owner's manual, because a lot of times people don't realize they have all of these wonderful features on their machine. And this one allows me to increase or decrease my presser foot pressure on fabric. And I was just doing something on a new tote bag that I'm working on. I haven't posted it yet, but I was working on curves and circles. So 99% of the time, I leave my presser foot pressure right in the middle, which is the average setting. Most of the time, I do not need to change that. But when I was working on curves and circles and I wanted much lighter pressure on the fabric so that I could manipulate it to the right and left, I dialed that all the way down to the lowest setting just to keep it nice and light. And if for some reason I had something where I really needed super strong pressure on the fabric, I could dial it all the way up. And I'm going to come back to a couple of slides. Wait a minute. Oops, wait a minute. Let me just come back because I want to show you where yours might be on your machine. I know on the old Evolution and Evolve, there was a knob right up here directly above the presser foot. And it was kind of not noticeable because it was flush with the top of the machine. But that was where you might find your presser foot pressure adjustment knob. And my little workaround with that is that most of them do not designate where the factory setting is. So what I always say is if you want to lighten or tighten the pressure, before you move that knob, take a picture with your smartphone so that you'll know when you want to put it back to the original setting, you'll know exactly where to go. And that's what I do on some of my things. And sometimes if I'm playing with different adjustments on my machine, whether it's stitch length, differential feed, I'll snap pictures just so that I don't forget what I did before and work on that. So I think we're ready. I'm just going to click ahead to where we were. And Elena, do we have any questions in the chat box?
Any questions? So far, not so far, so good.
Okay. Any questions about where something is on your machine or anything else? I can't see the chat box, so I can't see if anyone's typing in there.
Where is that on the Triumph? Kathy is asking.
The adjustment for the presser foot pressure? Is that what you're asking, Kathy?
Yes.
Oh, okay. It's in that same place. Actually, I think I did take that picture on the Triumph. So it's on that left side of your machine. It's just a plain white dial. Let me see if I can go back to that. Hang on. Right here. It's on that left side. This is what you're looking at up here, just to orient you a little bit better, is that's the tension setting for the cover chain stitch needles. Do you want me to go back to the beginning slide and I can point it out also? Would that be helpful?
Sure. And another question from Donna is, what sort of fabrics would you use increase pressure on the foot?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I have never really increased my presser foot pressure. I have found that my fabric fed perfectly fine on that average setting that you see the photo on, right in the middle. I would say if you were doing multiple layers and you found that some of the fabric was slipping by any chance, which is not likely, you might want to tighten up or increase your presser foot pressure. But honestly, I don't love doing that, only because I find on some fabrics, particularly ones with nap, but also on more delicate fabrics, that you want to be careful. If you increase your presser foot pressure too much, you may find that you get some little ridges or marks from the feed dogs on it. And what I would say is test it first with your scrap fabric that is the same as your project fabric. And when you're making samples, whether it's on your sewing machine or serger, samples are the coin of the realm. They will always give you all the information you need as far as all of your settings go. And if you want to try increasing your presser foot pressure, do it on your sample, but then really look at it to make sure there are no marks or any ridges or wrinkles or anything else on that fabric. But as I said, most of the time I leave mine right in the middle where you see it in the photograph, or when I'm doing curves and doing some surface design and embellishing, I might lighten the pressure on the presser foot. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes, that takes
Okay,
care of it.
right.
Thank
Okay, all right. So let's keep going with our photos. Oh, Elena, is there more?
Someone is just sharing that they increased the pressure to see if they could get a better ruffle on thin fabric, like a double gauze.
Oh, okay. And do you get a better ruffle? Now I'm asking the question.
We'll see. what
Okay.
they say.
Okay. All right. Go ahead.
If there's if some people were commenting the audio is coming and going. If your video or audio is coming and going, it might be the connection that you have in your location. So don't worry, we're going to send everybody the recording at the end. We'll email it to you so you can reference it, and we'll post it on YouTube as well.
Yes. And so you won't miss a word of my scintillating conversation. Okay. Okay. So have I answered all the questions thus far? We'll have time for more questions, certainly, as we go along.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now I've opened up the front of my machine so that you can clearly see this knob on my machine has two different functions. It is my stitch length adjuster. And you see the word standard and rolled hem on the face of the knob. Now, the stitch length adjusting is the exact same principle as on your sewing machine. The heavier or loftier, thicker fabrics, you're going to need a longer stitch length. If you're using something lightweight, you may want to shorten it up. And obviously, the lower the number, the shorter the stitch length. And again, it's exactly the same as on your sewing machine. But this one also says standard. So what does that mean? That means that I have my stitch finger engaged. And do you all know where your stitch finger is on your machine? I know somebody said one time they thought that it looked like it was sticking straight up, like at a 90-degree angle in this slide to the bed of the machine. It is not. It is flat. It lies flat at the side of the presser foot. And I took the presser foot off to get this shot so that you could see it. And that stitch finger is one of the three things that will determine the width of the stitch. We're not talking about the length, we're talking about the width, and whether or not that is engaged or disengaged. And I would say probably on 90% of machines, you can even adjust that. And again, look in your owner's manual. That can be adjusted to the left, closer to the needles, or you can move it out to the right. I think I have it at the maximum width to the right in this photo. And you can see it's a flat piece. So not only does it help widen out the stitches, it also supports the edge of the fabric. And that's important to know because on a balanced stitch, just like your regular overlock stitch that you're using for seams and things like that, you want your fabric to lie flat and smooth between the layers of the stitch itself. And we're going to talk about the stitch in a few minutes. But that stitch finger helps support and keep that fabric smooth and flat. But if you look in your owner's manual for the stitch finger information, it will probably tell you where you can adjust it. And again, on some machines, it may be when you open that door on the lower left, where there's a little knob to adjust it. And you may have one that will simultaneously move the knife with the stitch finger to get the exact correct cutting width as well. And these are all things that in a full-blown workshop we can go into, but this is just kind of like a quick little mini workshop right now. But if we go down to the next one, if I turn that same dial from standard to rolled hem, you see numbers, the exact same numbers with a circle around them. And when it's on that rolled hem setting, what is it doing? It's disengaging the stitch finger, and now you have a very thin little stitch pin. And on many machines, I know Janome has this on some of their machines, and I'm sure a bunch of brands do. On the bed of the machine, you have a lever toward the front, up in front of where the presser foot is, and it might have an S and an R. Guess what? It stands for standard stitch and rolled hem stitch. And what you have to do on that is when you are going to do a very delicate narrow stitch like a rolled hem, you probably, on those models that have that lever, you are going to have to get your knife out of the way and move that lever from S to R, and that's disengaging that stitch finger, and then you have that thin little stitch pin. So if you see the difference in the width of those, this little delicate stitch pin is not going to support the edge of the fabric. So keep that in mind. So this, whether your stitch finger is engaged or disengaged, and where it is to the right or the left, if you've got it moved all the way out to the right, you'll get a wider stitch. As you move it in closer to the needles, you'll have a narrower stitch. And you can see the distance between the stitch pin and your right needle, which you would only have in, you could ignore that left one for a rolled hem. It's very close. So again, it's going to allow you to get a nice narrow stitch. Now, on this machine, again, we have a stitch width dial, and that's what I was talking about before. You might have a dial that will move your stitch finger and your cutting blade, your knife, simultaneously, and that's what this one does. And no matter what brand people have of sergers, they usually see this double set of numbers. What does that mean? I get asked that in 100% of the classes that I do in person. Well, the second thing that determines the width of your stitch is your needles. When you've got your left overlock needle in, you're going to get the widest stitch. And if you remove that left needle and just have the right overlock needle in, you're going to automatically skinny down that stitch. And so when I have the stitch finger as far right as possible with the left needle in, guess what? My stitch width is 7.5 millimeters from left to right. If I remove that left needle but leave everything else the same, my stitch width is going to just be 5 millimeters. And on this machine, just as a nice little visual, they have this wide gray whorl that goes down to being very thin. And I say to people that the wider the whorl, the wider the stitch. And as you dial that down, that stitch finger and knife will move in closer to your needles to the left, and skinny down that stitch again. So now we've talked about two of the factors that determine stitch width in overlock mode only, whether you've got your left needle in or just your right needle, and where your stitch finger is. If it's engaged and moved all the way out to the right, you're going to get the widest stitch. As you move that in and move your knife in closer to the needles to the left, you're going to narrow down your stitch. Are there any questions about that at all? When I do some workshops with video, we can show that concept as well. But this is why it's good to consult your owner's manual and find out how you move these different things around. Do you have any questions, Elena?
Yeah, I think Carolyn might have a question. Carolyn, if you could type your question into the chat. I'm not sure if you raised your hand by accident or not, but Rita has a question, and can you repeat which needle to remove to alter the stitch width?
Okay, well, there are a couple of ways to do that. When you've got your left needle in, the left overlock, and we're going to show that in a slide in just a minute, and I think it'll be clear to you. Just keep in mind right now, Rita, keep in mind these numbers. 7.5 is the absolute widest width of the stitch on my machine with my left needle in. If I took out my left needle, I'm automatically skinnying down the stitch by 2.5 millimeters. So 7.5 minus 5 is 2.5 millimeters. So let me go to the next slide and let's take a look. This is just, this slide shows you that you want to make sure, and I have done this and I'll do it again, no matter how experienced or how expert you are on your sergers. Sometimes if you're in a hurry, this can happen to anybody, and it's happened to me within the last year, and I'm sure I'll do it again. Make sure your needles are all the way up in the needle bar. And I just saw something online. Somebody was saying, oh, her needles kept breaking and she wasn't sure what the problem was. What the problem was she didn't have it all the way up in the needle bar. And on some machines, the little channels that the needles have to go up in can be very tight against each other. So sometimes even if you're putting, just say you had your right needle in and now you want to do a 4-thread overlock and you want to pop in your left needle and you can't push it all the way up in the needle bar. Sometimes you have to loosen that little screw right down here on the right channel just to give you a scooch of room to get in. And so that's just something to keep in mind. And right down here, and this is going to go back, I think, to Rita's question about the stitch width. Here I have my left and right needles in. This would be how I've set up my needles for a 4-thread overlock. The 4-thread overlock has left needle, there's 1, right needle, there's 2 threads, upper looper 3, lower looper 4. That's your 4-thread overlock. What's the difference between the space in between the needles? About 2.5 millimeters. So if I have that left needle in, and we're going to see that on the stitches themselves, and I think the concept will be very clear to you then. But if I have that left needle in, I'm going to get my widest stitch. If I take that out, I'm automatically skinnying down the stitch width by 2.5 millimeters. But the thing to remember is that your needle heights are different. Your left needle should always be higher, and right in front here where you can see the little hand, that's my upper looper. And when you stitch, that's the one that you see come up and over your fabric as you're stitching along. And the reason your needle heights are different is to compensate for the arc of that looper coming up and over. That's just a little technical information. But that's the reason you want to make sure that they are not level with each other. If they are level with each other, one of them or maybe both of them are not fully inserted all the way up in the needle bar.
Nice.
Any
So,
questions at all?
Wendy has a question.
Hi, Wendy.
Do you have any tips for getting the needle into the correct place and making sure it's sitting correctly?
Well, you just want to make sure, let me see if I can go back here. You may, these use an Allen wrench. Some of them have traditional screws, but you want to make sure they're loose enough that they go all the way up. Now on this machine, you have these little windows. So I can see that the top of my needles is touching the top of the edge of the window sill, for lack of or window frame on the top. So I can see if my needles are not in all the way. But the thing I would suggest is just make sure that both of your screws are loose enough to be able to easily insert your needles. But that said, on these ones that require an Allen wrench, these are teeny tiny screws. And on the Ovation and the Triumph, I don't know how they engineered the screws, but they cannot fall out. I believe, as far as I know, and maybe this has changed, no other brands have that. And I know on my old Evolution, one night I didn't tighten the screw back up after I removed a needle. And when I was surging along, the vibration of the machine rattled that teeny little screw out, and I have to this day never found it. It just rolled away off into who knows where. And so I had to wait till, and this stuff never happens at, 2 in the afternoon. It always happens after all the stores are closed. So I had to wait till the next day to go back to a dealer and buy a new one to put in. But on most of your machines, you want to make sure that those screws are loose enough to get your needles in. But even if you remove, say, the left needle to do a 3-thread narrow, re-tighten that screw and don't over-tighten it. Don't do it so tight that you strip the screw. But just make sure that it's secure in there so that the vibration of the machine as you're stitching doesn't rattle it out, because it is possible to happen on most machines.
Thank you.
Okay, are we good on that?
I think so. Any more questions? Just type them in the chat.
Okay, now I was talking earlier about the differential feed lever, and we're not going to go into a huge discussion on differential feed right now. Again, we can do that in a full workshop. But here's what I was talking about. You have the front feed dogs and the back feed dogs. When your differential feed is on any setting, whether you've got it on 1 or N, you've got it cranked up to 2, or you've got it lower than the 1 or N setting, your back feed dogs never change speed. That's the difference in differential feed. The only thing that you're adjusting is your front feed dogs and how quickly it feeds. The higher the number when you're adjusting your differential feed, the faster your front feed dogs are going. And that is very handy, again, on things like knits that you don't want to stretch, or unstable grain lines like a bias grain line on a woven fabric. But it's also great for a lot of decorative techniques as well. Things like gathering, you'd want to crank that differential feed up to 2. And there might be other settings that you would have to adjust depending on what machine you have. But this is the difference in differential feed, that you can change the speed of the front feed dogs, but the back feed dogs always, always stay the same. They're a constant speed. So, and differential feed, once you get the hang of it and you are fearless on changing it, There are so many things that you can do and so many great results that you can get. A lot of people kind of shy away from working with knits because they don't have a handle on differential feed. And again, it is such a fabulous feature that a serger has and a sewing machine does not have, that it's well worth getting to know how to work with it. And again, when we do a full workshop, we can talk more about that. And I had the presser foot off again for that slide so that you could clearly see the two sets. Now, this might only be an issue if you have a combination serger that has cover stitch as well as overlock capability. Make sure your threads are coming down, and in back of the thread guide that is designated for overlock or cover stitch. Sometimes when I'm working and I start off with a 4-thread overlock stitch in a hands-on workshop, I'll see people with their threads down here, and if they've got a combo machine, all of a sudden they're jogged way over here, and then they're into the needles. You want to make sure that your thread comes down in a nice straight line, and because that can affect the tension on them too, and how well it stitches, or if it stitches correctly. Now I have my presser foot back on the machine, and again, if you have a 4-thread overlock, you may only have these 2 indicator ridges on the toe of the foot. If you have a combination machine that has 3 cover chain stitch needles, you might have 5 of these. The only ones we're going to be concerned with today are the ones in the green circle. This one is aligned with your right overlock needle right here. And this one is aligned, excuse me, with your left overlock needle. I don't have a cold. I think it's just allergies. And so when you're doing a seam or anything else, if you've got your left overlock needle in, you'd want to line this up with where your designated seam allowance is, whether it's a 1/2 inch from the edge of the fabric or 5/8 or 1/4 inch, whatever it is, depending on the needle that you have in. With a 4-thread, it would be your left needle forming the seam. If you're doing a 3-thread overlock, which I use a lot on looser knit garments, it would probably just be your right needle. I don't feel like I need a 4-thread, but these are for your cover chain stitch needles. So we're not going to talk about those today. And you can see again, left is lined up with the left needle, right is lined up with the right needle. And I hear a lot of people say, I never know where my machine is going to stitch, and they never even notice these indicator ridges. So I do like to make a point of pointing those out. Okay, so let's talk about our loopers. As I said earlier, here's your upper looper. And this little funny thing over here is called a subsidiary looper. We're not going to talk about that today. That's for when you're doing a 2-thread stitch. But here is your upper looper, and that's the one that comes up and over as I'm stitching on the fabric. The lower looper is right in front of it, and that's the one that on some machines can be a bear to get threaded. But not always. Some machines are much easier, but with the air threading, it's super easy to do that. And then if you have a combo machine that has cover chain stitch, you have a 3rd looper, and that's your chain looper, and that's in front, and that's a little bit harder to see because you never really see the eye of it. It's pretty far left under the bed of the machine. And I always say my little mnemonic for remembering which one is which is get a clue about your loopers. CLU, chain, lower looper, upper looper. They're alphabetical from front to back. And if you have a 4-thread overlock machine, you have just get a loo about your loopers, the lower looper and then the upper looper. And this is just a shot of the cutting blade or the knife, and there is no white stripe on it. It's just the way the light hit it when I photographed it. So there's your knife right here, okay? So these are your loopers. And any questions again on anything?
We have a question from Nancy. On the evolution, how many clicks is the N setting? It's hard to tell if she's on N if she doesn't make a sample.
It should be labeled. I'm trying to remember. The Evolution was the second serger I owned, and I haven't looked at it for a while. But the lever, I believe, should be right in line with it. It should be not quite in the middle, because you can only go down probably 2 clicks below that. So if you bring your lever on the Evolution, the differential feed lever, all the way down to the bottom, and then so you're on the lowest differential feed setting, click once, then click a second time, and I believe that will put you into the end setting. But if you shoot me a picture of your serger in my email, go to gail@gailpatrice.com, or I can look online. I believe that will put you on the end setting, Nancy.
Okay.
So yeah.
And Dawn chimed in too. Thanks, Dawn. Dawn says 2 clicks from the bottom also.
Oh, yay. Okay. I see so many sergers when I do American Sewing Guild events around the country, and people bring their own sergers. I see Janome, Faf, Babylock, Brother, Bernina, all sorts of sergers from Elna, tons of different sergers. So sometimes I have to really think about it when I'm not looking at it. So, okay, does that answer that question? Anything else so far? Are we good? Okay. We can forge ahead. Okay, now let's get to Decode the Stitch. And this is really kind of fun, because I will tell you, when I first got my serger, and I used to look at that stitch, and I would be going over to the dealer for lessons and stuff like that. If I brought a sample of what I was doing at home and it didn't look right, and I could say to them, something doesn't look right, but I don't know what it is, and they'd go, oh yeah, yep, that's your upper looper, your lower looper, blah, blah, blah. I could never understand how they could figure out what they were looking at. But all of a sudden, when the light bulb went on and I understood what I was looking at, I was like, okay, this isn't rocket science. So I put this slide up and included this one on the far left. This is a 5-thread safety stitch that you could get on a combination machine that has a chain looper, or if you had a dedicated cover stitch machine, you could do you could first serge a 3-thread overlock here, and then go to your cover stitch machine and do a chain stitch over here. So you would have 5 threads on this, 3 threads for the overlock, the needle thread, and the chain looper thread that would form this stitch. But we're not going to work with that today. But just so that you see that, if you look in some of your ready to wear clothes, especially wovens, this is the stitch for construction seams that they use most frequently. But we talked about 2 out of the 3 things that determine stitch width: needle position, left or right for overlock, and whether the stitch finger is engaged or disengaged, and whether it's far right or left. The third item is tension, and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes for a rolled hem stitch. And you can see the rolled hem on the far right is the narrowest stitch that you can get. It's very delicate, very beautiful, and it's so useful for a lot of different things, not just hems. So here we have the 5-thread, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because I just talked about that. But let's go, and there's the underside, and the chain looper thread really does make what looks like a chain on the underside. But let's go to our overlock stitches. Here's the 4-thread overlock. which is a balanced stitch. You can see the fabric is flat and smooth underneath. And why do you call it balanced? Because the upper and lower looper threads are meeting precisely on the edge of the fabric. Let's look at what we're looking at on the anatomy of this. Here is my left needle straight stitch line. Here is my right needle straight stitch line. The loops that cross on the top or upper side of the fabric is your upper looper thread. Okay, left needle, right needle, and the loops are your upper looper thread. They're on the upper or top side of the fabric as you're stitching. Here it is, seeing the right side and the wrong side, or the underside, the lower side of the fabric. You can see your left overlock needle thread very distinctly. The right needle one is very indistinct. It looks almost like pin dots going along the bottom side of the fabric. Is there anything wrong with your machine? No. That's the way it looks. It's not distinct. It does look like pin dots. And the loop that forms on the underside or lower side of your fabric is your lower looper thread. So that's what you're looking at on that. Now, here is a 3-thread wide. What's missing? My right needle. You can see on the next slide, here's my 4-thread overlock. Here's my 3-thread. I took out my right overlock needle, and you can see the width is exactly the same because I kept that left needle in. It doesn't matter whether the right needle is in or not, as long as I'm keeping that stitch finger and everything where it was to begin with on this stitch. The only thing that's missing is this line of stitching, but the stitch width is the same. Does that make sense for everybody? Any questions about that so far? And I use, just to give you an idea, I use my 3-thread wide for if I want to do a decorative edge on something like placemats or a table topper or a table runner with thick decorative threads. Because that's not a seam that's going to, or an edge that's not going to get any stress at all, I don't need that right needle in for that extra security. Some brands call this a 4-thread safety stitch because you have that security of the second needle in. But for something decorative on an edge with no stress, I'd go to the 3-thread wide if that's the look that I was going for. Any questions about that so far? No? Okay, we can move on. Now, okay, we've got a 3-thread wide with the left needle in on the lower part of the picture. Here is my 3-thread narrow. What have I done? I've taken out my left needle and cut that thread. I just have my right needle in. What's the difference from here to here? About 2.5 millimeters on my machine. And you remember on that dial with the double set of numbers, I could either have a stitch width of 7.5 for maximum width, or with my just right needle in, 5 millimeters. There you see it right there. Left needle, no left needle, just the right needle.
Nice. I have an actual question, Gail.
Okay.
Questions are coming in.
Yeah.
Question from Linda. Where would you put your decorative thread?
On that, if I were doing something like a placemat or a table runner, where you would see both the top and bottom edges of a table runner or something like that, I would put decorative thread in my upper and lower loopers. Do they have to be the same color? Absolutely not. A lot of times I like to change up the colors on the upper and lower looper threads. And I think you get the nicest looking decorative thread if you pretty much coordinate your needle thread to that color. I think it looks really, really nice. But there are instances, say you're using a variegated thread in your upper looper and a variegated in the lower, or one might be a solid decorative thread. You could, it's your choice. Maybe you want to use a totally different color on your needle. But what I would do on that is I would make a sample, and that would be something where I would test my stitch length and just get all of my settings exactly the way I want them to be. And in a workshop we can talk about changing stitch length for heavier decorative threads, but things like pearl crown rayon are fabulous for that. The 12 weight threads like jean stitch thread or spaghetti, or what are some of the other ones? I forget some of the other brands. There are so many beautiful brands of decorative threads. There are tons of them, but I love the thicker ones for things like that. But those decorative threads would go in your looper for that particular application.
Okay, great. And so would you say you would use a 12 weight thread or an 8 weight thread?
Either one. It's your choice, because both, well, let me qualify that. Hold on, I'm going to back up a second. On some machines, they're very, very good at working with decorative threads. And you can put any weight thread in that you want and get a beautiful, beautiful stitch. It really and truly depends on what machine you're working on. Some machines are a little more persnickety, for lack of a better word, about how well they'll stitch with some decorative threads. But when I've done hands-on workshops with ASG chapters where everybody brings their own machine and you have a variety of brands and levels of machines, like as far as the price point on them and things like that, I've usually given a 12 weight equivalent of, say, like a jean stitch thread. Most machines will do well with that. You have to just test it on your particular machine. And I always say, use the thread that gives you the best looking stitch. If you're not getting a good looking stitch with a heavier weight thread, like a 12 weight, or even heavier with an 8 weight, back off and use a lighter weight thread. Even something like a beautiful machine embroidery thread might look nice and really shorten your stitch length for good coverage on the edge. But that really just depends on the machine. I've never had a problem with decorative threads on my machine, but I do know for a fact that on some of the more, say, entry-level sergers that are a little less expensive, some of them can be a little bit more picky about how well they want to stitch with a heavier weight. So the way you would want to find out on your machine is just to test it. And definitely play around with your stitch length on that, because that can make a big difference. If your stitch is too short with a heavyweight decorative thread, it's going to have a really hard time stitching. But lengthen it out, and what I do is I'll cut a big long strip of my project fabric, and I'll have a ballpoint pen or a Sharpie marker, and I'll have my stitch length on one thing. I'll stitch about 6 or 8 inches, and then draw a line, right? And this is just scrap fabric, so it doesn't matter. And I'll put my stitch length was 3.5. Then I'll shorten my stitch length to, say, 3. Stitch another 6 or 8 inches, draw a line and put 3.0, shorten it up a little more to maybe 2.5, and go down, and then compare what it looks like on the edge of the fabric. And again, when you're making your sample, especially with decorative threads, use the same number of layers that you're going to be stitching through on your actual project. Like if you're doing a table runner with a thin batting in it, sandwich your top and bottom fabrics with some of that batting on your sample, because that does make a difference. You'll always want to make your sample and test strip match the way you're going to be stitching on your actual project.
Great. That's good information. Thank you.
Okay.
And okay, we have a question from Stephanie. And what is wrong if the looper threads are away from the edge of the fabric, like they are wider than the fabric edge?
Yep, they're hanging off the edge. Okay, that is a huge thing. Now, on some machines, when I was talking about adjusting the stitch finger and where your knife is, I would say almost any serger that has been manufactured in the last 20 years at least, you can adjust where your knife is. Chances are, if your loops are hanging off the edge of your fabric, what brand machine do you have, Stephanie, just before I go into a discussion about that?
We'll just give her a second.
Yep.
Ovation.
Oh, okay. On the Ovation. All right. Now that will simultaneously move your knife and stitch finger. So that's not an issue on that machine. Chances are, if your loops are hanging off, if you have your stitch selector dial, that's the ABCD, if you are just using your right needle and your stitch selector dial is on A, you're putting too much thread into each stitch, and that's allowing those loops to hang off. You probably have your stitch selector dial on the wrong setting for that width stitch.
Okay.
And then on other machines that don't have that stitch selector dial, what that does on the Baby Lock, and I always like to say, I do not work for Baby Lock. I don't make any commission on their machines or anything else, but that's what I happen to have. And, but on that stitch selector dial automatically, when you are on either A, B, C, or D, it knows the kind of stitch that you want to do, and it feeds a different amount of thread per stitch. So I would say if you're doing, say, a 3-thread narrow and you're on A, it's putting too much thread in there and it's allowing the loops to hang off the edge of the fabric. Does that make sense for you?
Let's see. Would you reference your manual? This is a question from me, actually. Would you reference your manual to determine which stitch selector setting you need to be on?
Yes, absolutely. A is when you have, and this is not talking about decorative things like flat locking or something like that. That's a whole different animal. But A means you're working with your left overlock needle in. It's feeding the most fabric. And if you think of that stitch selector lever on A, B, C, and D, think of it like test scores. If you get an A on a test, it means you've scored the most points available. When you're on A on the stitch selector dial, you're feeding the most thread per stitch in because you're using a wider stitch and it needs more thread for correct coverage. Then when you go down to B as in baby, you're probably using just your right needle in there. And it needs a little less thread, about 2.5 millimeters less of thread per stitch. So if you get a B on a test, you got a good score, but fewer points. Go down to C, and then you are doing an even narrower stitch. It's feeding less thread. And then when you go down to D as in delicate, that is doing a couple of things. It's tightening up the lower looper tension and feeding the least amount of thread per stitch.
Okay, great. We have a couple more questions.
Sure.
So does hanging loops depend on the type of fabric? It was perfect on cotton, but hanging on bamboo stretch cotton.
If it's hanging out on bamboo, it's a knit, obviously. Chances are what's happening is that you need to increase your differential feed for that bamboo knit. Because it's stretchy, as you're stitching, if you watch on a scrap piece, don't test it on your actual garment or whatever you're working on, like a t-shirt or a tunic or something. If you look at it with your differential feed on the setting that you've been using, you'll see that the fabric moves away from the knife a little bit because it's stretching. What you would need to do is to increase your differential feed and speed up those front feed dogs to keep that fabric moving and keep it from stretching, because it's almost like when you stretch a piece of elastic, or if you take a piece of your t-shirt knit fabric and you stretch it crosswise, if you pull super hard, what happens to the width of the fabric? It gets skinnied down. It narrows down because it's stretching lengthwise. The same thing is happening when you're stitching with your differential feed setting a little bit too low. So maybe crank it up one notch at a time until you get those loops to stay on the edge of the fabric. And if you're using a machine where you need to adjust the knife separately from where the stitch finger is, you'll want to check that in your manual as well. But if you want to shoot me an email about that with a photo and your settings and what brand of machine you're working on, I could probably give you a little more information. But I would definitely say it's probably a differential feed setting that you need to increase, because you need to compensate for the stretch of the fabric, skinning it down and moving it off to the left of where your knife is.
Great, thank you. I've got another question on hanging loops, and then I'm going to back it up to Mary's question about embroidery thread. So the hanging loops question, can hanging loops also happen if you inadvertently pull your fabric to the left? I have this problem when serging circles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, most definitely. And stitching around circles. In fact, I have an upcoming tip clip about working on curves. You always have to make sure that when you're working, say, on the outside edge of a circle, if you're doing a circular table topper or placemat or something like that, you have to stitch more slowly. You also want to shorten your stitch up a little bit, but by stitching more slowly, it allows you to, and stop frequently, and I mean like every few stitches. It sounds like it's kind of a pain, and it is kind of not, I wouldn't say it's monotonous, but you just have to understand that to keep the edge of the fabric right next to where your knife is, on those outside edges, that edge is always going to curve away from the knife just naturally on the outside curves. So you have to stop every few stitches and just maybe raise the presser foot a little bit and just keep that edge right up against where your knife is, and maybe skim off the whiskers on the edge of the fabric. And skimming off the whiskers means you're just cutting off those little threads on the edge of your fabric. But that's a very common thing, and that does take practice to do. But depending on what brand machine you have, if there is a very short little foot that's designed to work around curves nicely, buy it, because it is worth every single penny. By having that shorter foot, it allows you to make it easier to manipulate the fabric. And remember, I talked about adjusting your presser foot pressure. There's a time when you're going around those curves that you will want to lower your presser foot pressure, just to make it easy to manipulate the fabric and keep moving it to the right as you go along.
Okay, great, thank you. And A question from Mary. If I use embroidery thread for the looper, do I insert the spool upside down on the spool pin? And this is for a triumph.
It depends on the fabric. Are you talking about whether you remove that little cone holder, that little triangular cone holder? You would want to take that off so you can get your spool on. I personally have just used my spools in their normal orientation on the machine, and I haven't had a problem with it.
Okay.
But again, if you have had a problem, by all means, flip the spool over, but just take off that little cone holder that is on the spool pin to begin with. Don't try to pop your spool on top of that, because that can create a problem.
Okay, great. And we've got one last question and we can probably move on. So,
Okay.
Question from Gail. When you want to remove a serger stitching on the 4-thread overlock, which thread should you release so that it is easy to remove the whole length of the stitching?
I'll use either tiny scissors or a seam ripper, and I just cut through about every 4 or 5 stitches, depending on what your stitch length is, on both of the needle threads. I find that the easiest way to do it. If you can just cut through your left one and it will release all of the loops, then that's fine. But I typically just go through both of the needle threads if I'm doing it with a 4-thread, but it's only your needle thread that you have to cut that straight stitch. I'm looking right now, I still have that 3-thread narrow with the stitch finger comparison on. Are you all seeing that slide?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is the thread, the straight stitch thread that you would want to cut. That is the only thing that's holding the looper threads on. So if you snip that every 4 or 5 stitches and then pull it from the other side, it'll pull the whole thing out and it'll release those looper threads as well.
Okay, great.
Was that Gail Diefendorfer, by the way?
Yeah.
Oh, hi, Gail. Gail from Pennsylvania. Okay. Okay. I think we haven't talked about this slide too much, but again, with stitch width, I have my stitch finger as far right and as far away from the needles as it can be with just the right needle thread or right needle in. So I've got a wider stitch. If I want to skinny it down some more, I'm just going to move that stitch finger in closer to the needles and narrow that down. So on probably 90% of machines, you can adjust where that stitch finger is. And again, you can really customize to within a fraction of a millimeter the look of a stitch and the width of a seam allowance that you want for your garment or other type of project. So that's just knowing where these different components are, how they work, and what you can do with them. Again, once you know all these different things, it gives you so much more freedom to work and get exactly the customized look that you're going for. Okay, now here's a 3-thread narrow balance stitch with the stitch finger disengaged. I've narrowed it down even more. And again, it's balanced because those loops are precisely on the edge of the fabric as I go along. So with the C setting on those baby locks with that stitch selector, you can get a nice little narrow balance stitch, but you can do the same thing on your other machines by disengaging your stitch finger and keeping all your tension settings on the normal setting and get a nice narrow little stitch. Now we're onto an unbalanced stitch. And what does that mean? It means that we've changed the tension setting somewhere along the line so they're not all balanced. all of the stitches we've been looking at so far have had our needle tensions and our looper tensions all on normal setting. And when you're going to do a rolled hem on the edge of something, or rolled hem pin tucks, which are absolutely beautiful, and I have those on a bunch of different samples, you are talking about an unbalanced stitch. And if you look in your manuals, if you have knobs and dials to adjust for tensions, you will see that when you go to a rolled hem setting, the steps that they tell you to follow are: number one, disengage your stitch finger, and whether you have to open that little door on the left of the machine, and there's a spring-loaded button that you push and you swing the stitch finger down, or on some machines that have that lever on the bed of the machine with the S and the R, and you move it from S standard to R rolled hem, you're disengaging your stitch finger. But also, if you have traditional tension settings, it will probably tell you to leave your needle tension, right needle tension on normal, and you're going to only have your right needle in for that rolled hem because we want a thinner, narrower stitch. The needle tension's on normal, probably your upper looper tension is on normal, but here's the unbalanced part of the equation. The lower looper tension is going to be cranked up to a higher number. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen because I have a little way that I like to describe what makes a rolled hem roll, and so you can see me. I have to tell you that before all of the shutdown across the world, I had a chock-a-block full schedule of workshops to do all over the country. So this is such a nice thing for me to hear people asking questions and doing things, because I really miss my workshops. But getting back to a rolled hem, what makes a rolled hem roll, and why is it an unbalanced stitch? Because your needle tension and upper looper tensions are on a normal setting, but your lower looper tension on that thread is much higher. It's like a tug of war. And what I like to say is, if you have 5 little kids on this end of the rope and 5 NFL players on the other end of the rope, who's going to win the tug of war? The big guys. Well, the big guys are like that high tension setting on the lower looper. The little kids are like your upper looper normal tension settings. So instead of those loops meeting very precisely on the edge of your fabric, because your lower looper tension is so much higher, it's going to pull the upper looper thread across the fabric and bring it to the underside of the fabric, the lower side of the fabric. And because you've disengaged that stitch finger that was supporting the fabric on balanced stitches, that thin little stitch pin doesn't give that support. So as the lower looper thread is pulling the upper looper thread across the top and around the edge of the fabric to the underside, it's allowing the edge of the fabric to roll under. And that's what makes a rolled hem roll. So, is that good for everybody? Is that clear? Okay. Now, I think I have to go back to, where am I going, Elena, for my slideshow? Do I do Command L?
Share the screen. Share your screen.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. I got it. Sorry about that, folks. I forgot. Okay, good. Okay, so here we are back to our rolled hem, and you can see it's very delicate. It's beautiful. But is a rolled hem suitable for all fabrics? No. You don't want to use a rolled hem on a really heavy wool or a polar fleece or any kind of a chunky fabric. When you're using a rolled hem setting, you want to think in terms of light to medium weight fabrics: linens, cottons, rayons. You could use it on some wools if they're lightweight enough. Definitely you could. But again, test. And anything that's chunky or lofty, no, you're not going to want to do that. But, or also very, very stiff, like some denims, for instance, that are very heavy. Are you going to get a good rolled hem on them? Probably not. But I will say, if your fabric is a medium weight and you really want to do a rolled hem and you have specific tension knobs and dials, try cranking up that lower looper tension a little bit higher than what your instruction manual tells you to do, and see if that doesn't help. And while we're talking about the owner's manual or instruction manuals, what I like to say to people is think of the settings in your manual as guidelines, not hard and fast rules. Like a lot of times they'll give you a suggested stitch length. Well, guess what? Maybe you don't like that stitch length for your fabric. You can change it. You're the boss. Maybe you're finding that you need to increase your tension setting for a particular type of fabric. Try it on your sample fabric. If it works, great. And if it doesn't, oh well, it doesn't work. But you can play around with those tension settings and other stitch length settings or differential feed settings even on your samples. You do not necessarily have to follow their numbers in your instruction manual to the letter of the law. Those are guidelines, not hard and fast rules. So just going back and taking a look at the difference between a balanced and unbalanced stitch. Here's that narrow balanced stitch where the loops are meeting on the edge. Here's the rolled hem where that upper looper thread isn't meeting the lower looper until it's on the underside of the fabric, because it's rolled that edge and that lower looper tension on the thread has pulled the upper looper thread to the underside. It's such a pretty stitch, but that's understanding why it rolls and why you're changing those tension settings is a good thing to know. And right before the lockdown, I did a workshop in Sarasota, Florida, which was very nice in February. I'll tell you, it was beautiful weather. And we were doing a rolled hem as one of the techniques. And one woman was not getting a good rolled hem on her serger. I don't know, I forget what brand she had. So the fabric itself was not rolling. So I said, well, let's crank up that lower looper tension and see if it works. And we had to crank it all the way up to 9 on her machine. I remember that. And then the edge of the fabric did roll. And she said, well, how did you know that? And I said, because that's the way the rolled hem stitch works. You need that high tension on the lower looper. And I think the fabric that she was working with was a little bit heavier, but by cranking up the lower looper tension, it rolled and she had a beautiful rolled hem edge on the fabric. So now we're back to kind of looking. Here's your rolled hem, the narrowest one of all, and that's by no stitch finger. If the stitch finger is disengaged, we've increased tension on the lower looper and we're in the right needle. Here we have the stitch finger engaged, right needle, but balanced tensions. All of them are the same, and we have a narrow stitch. Here is a slightly wider 3-thread narrow, and that's with the right needle, but my stitch finger's all the way out to the right. Here it is with the stitch, or partially out to the right. Here it is all the way out to the right. Here's the very widest one on that. Here is my 4-thread overlock, and that's the one with the chain stitch with a 3-thread. Any questions on that at all?
We'll see if we have some questions trickling in. I don't see any right now, but I know, Gail, that you love answering questions. So as people are sewing and serging and working on their projects and you come across a question, I know, Gail, you're always willing to help, so send an email to Gail at Gail Patrice with your questions.
Yes, I'm very happy to hear from people. And when people watch tip clips, if they have a question about that, I really do get back to you as quickly as I can. And I always say, if you don't hear from me within a few hours, that usually means that I'm doing an event. But since nobody's doing any events around the country, or very few, they're kind of starting to open up a little bit, I can get back to you pretty darn quickly. And I try to get back as fast as possible because everybody wants to keep going on their projects. So I'm delighted to help you. This is just a little slide. Did you have a question?
There are a couple questions. Do you recommend certain types of needles?
Yes, and that's a good question. You want to change your needles frequently on your serger, every 6 to 8 hours of sewing, just the way you do on your sewing machine. And that is something I'm glad you asked. Sometimes when people get skip stitches or their stitches aren't formed well, I think I'm going to stop my screen share for right now so you can see me as I'm talking. Okay, here we are. Sometimes in workshops, somebody will say, oh, my stitch doesn't look very good. And I go over and I look at it and all their settings, everything looks fine as far as that goes. But I'll say, when was the last time you put a new needle in? And they'll say, oh, I think I did it last year or 6 months ago. A lot of times all it is a matter of changing the needles. In overlock mode, you can use a regular needle. Like most of the time I'll try to use an 80-12 needle. Schmetz makes a great needle. You can use organ needles, but whoops, let me just lower that. Hang on a second.
Yeah, and I know that Schmetz has a really great app for different types of needles and what their uses are for. So that might be something interesting to download. Oh, Gail, sorry, I muted you. You'll have to unmute yourself. And you just want to hover over the video, find that toolbar. There you go. You're good.
Okay, but, oh, okay, here I am back again. Okay, so any kind of a needle will work well. You never, on any serger, want to go bigger than a size 16 needle. You want to, the maximum you would want to go is a size 16. Now, if you're in covered chain stitch mode, you're going to want to go to an ELX 705 needle, because you'll get a better stitch without skipping or malformation with an ELX 705. And again, those can be Schmetz. I have, the one thing I will say about those though is that I have never seen those available in the big box stores, things like Joann's, the chain stores. Usually you have to get those at your dealer or order them online. And I don't have a source online that I can think of off the top of my head. You could Google it. But the ELX 705 for cover chain stitching is my needle of choice, and the one that is going to give you the best result. But again, in overlock, you can use a regular needle. But choose your size according to the weight of your fabric, the same way as you would do on your sewing machine. But do change it for about every 6 to 8 hours. And if you live in an area that has a cold winter and you like to work on polar fleece, I find that polar fleece dulls my needles and rotary cutter blades pretty quickly. So after I finish any project, even if it's pretty quick on my serger or sewing machine, I take that needle out, toss it, and put it in a fresh one, because I always will get a better result. There's something about polar fleece that really does dull them and blades quickly. So that's just a suggestion if you live someplace, or even if you're in a warm climate, but sew for somebody else in the family who lives in a cooler climate.
Thanks. That's good information. if you use woolly thread, and I think you mean woolly nylon, but Judy, if you mean something else, please type it in. So if you use woolly nylon thread for a rolled hem, which looper?
Oh, okay. Woolly nylon or woolly polyester, you would use it. I always say in rolled hem setting, your money looper is the upper looper, because when you're doing a rolled hem, you're going to stitch your fabric with the right side of your garment or whatever project you're working on face up. The right side is going to be the top side of the fabric. And that upper looper thread is the one that you see that goes across the fabric and rolls to the underside. You can use regular serger cone thread in your needle and your lower looper though for that. But with that woolly nylon or woolly polyester, that's your upper looper.
Awesome.
You can also use it in the lower looper if you want for a rolled hem, but it's not going to show because that lower looper thread is on the wrong side of the garment if that's what you're working on. So I always say save the money. I'm sure the thread companies wouldn't be happy to hear me say it, but I say save the money and just put it in your upper looper. And one thing about woolly nylon or woolly polyester to keep in mind is woolly nylon is nylon. And when you go to press it, make sure you test your temperature on your iron, because woolly nylon melts at a low temperature setting. So if you're going to be pressing something with woolly nylon and you don't want to melt the thread, lower the temperature on your iron. Woolly polyester is a synthetic, the way polyester fabric is, but it does have a higher melting point, so you can use a slightly hotter iron on that without melting the thread. So that's just something. I'm glad you asked that about the woolly nylon, because I have done that where I have forgotten and had my iron on a high setting, and suddenly I have melted thread on the edge. So, sometimes people think when you're an instructor, you do these workshops all over, we never make a mistake. Guess what? You can make a mistake just as easily if you're rushing or whatever. So those are just things that I've learned along the way, the hard way. Do we have more questions?
We have a couple more questions. We have a lot of great comments coming in saying, thank you. This was an excellent seminar. I'm learning so much. So we're glad and we appreciate all of you. Hi from the UK and all around.
Oh, the UK. Oh, how nice. Thank you for joining me.
And let's see where that question went. How do you secure the end of a line of serging?
Okay. Now, depending on what you're doing, most of the time, if I am doing a seam or something like that, I will serge off, I'll chain off the fabric. We're in overlock mode. And I will take a double-eyed needle. Let me grab one here. I can show it to you, and I hope you can see it. Can you see it up close? Yeah, you can see it. It's got two eyes, but that doesn't make any difference. Or if you have a bodkin or say an upholstery needle, you can do the same thing. I take I'll chain off a few inches, and I'll take that thread chain, put it in the double-eyed needle or bodkin, and thread it under my stitching, and then clip the excess length of that. You don't need 3 inches under your stitch. But also, if I'm doing, say, a rolled hem on napkins, what I do is I serge one edge, cut the thread, turn my fabric, do the next edge, next edge, next edge, but I do them all separately. And then I've got 4 thread tails in the corner. What I do before I clip any of those thread tails, because it's a rolled hem, it's too thin to pull those threads through. You run the risk of pulling that rolled hem right off the edge of the fabric. What I do with that is I use Frayed Check, and that was the first generation seam sealant. They came out with another one called Frayed Block that has a softer finish when it's dry, but I don't find that it's quite as secure. If I am doing something with decorative threads, I would tend, if I've got multiple layers, I would chain off the fabric. And because the decorative threads might be thicker, like a pearl crown rayon or jean stitch, a 12 weight, I don't find the seam sealants work well on those. They're too heavy for the seam sealants to really hold. What I do is I undo those, the thread chain stitches, straighten out those threads, and then I'll take my bodkin or double-eyed needle and I will feed those thread tails between the layers of the fabric, say like on a table runner, so that you don't see them under the stitching since it's exposed on something like a placemat or a table runner. But I run those through. And if I'm doing something like that, say on a tassel where I'm running off yards and yards of a thread chain in a rolled hem setting, I use something like super glue, because that it dries with a hard bead, but it is very secure and the thread tails tend not to unravel with that. But so you can either thread your fabric through. The other thing that you can do, if the edge of the fabric, if the stitching is not going to show, like say on the wrong side or something, that's only going to be on the inside of a garment, never seen from the public side, is when you get to the end of your stitching or the end of your fabric, you can chain off a little bit, raise the presser foot, flip that fabric and come back and stitch an inch right over that end of that, and then just swerve off the fabric. And that will, and then you can just clip the threads, because that's never going to go anywhere. And again, that's something we can demo in a full day. How many of you would be interested in doing, say, a 1 or 2 or even 3 day workshop to learn more about your sergers, where it's not just slides, you'd see me working, and you know, you'd be free to answer or ask questions as we go along? Is that something that you'd be interested in? Okay. All right. So I will work on that, and keep your eye out, and we will.
Yes, I would like it.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. So we can do that, definitely. And we can work on getting different stitches and different techniques and some projects, which might be kind of fun.
Definitely. Yeah, we have.
Could I ask a question? I'm sorry. Could I ask a question real quick?
Is this Rita?
Actually,
No, oh no, this is Con. I'm sorry, I've never done this before. I was wondering if you decided to do something like that to help with time-wise and everything. There were some questions I had or I thought about after the session today. Maybe write those down, and those could be things that you might go over, maybe?
Absolutely. And
okay,
you can,
thank you.
Yeah, if anyone has questions or things that they would specifically like me to cover in a workshop, my email address is Gail, Gail, at gailpatrice.com. You can say, hi, I took your little mini workshop this morning, and I'd be interested in doing a hands-on workshop online, and these are things that I have questions about, or things that I would like to cover in those workshops. And or if it's a question, just a question about anything random that I can answer right then and there, I'll be happy to get back to you.
Do you think you might be able to fit one in before the end of 2020, maybe?
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So any other questions, Elena, that you see in the chat box?
Yeah, a lot of comments. So what is the easiest way to undo a thread chain is one, and another one is how often should the knife be changed?
Well, to tell you the truth, I just changed my knife earlier this year. And this is the honest truth. For all the years I've been serging, I didn't talk about pinning when you're using pins at the serger. But typically I use either Wonder Clips or I have my pin so far to the left, the knife can't possibly touch it. Well, I was rushing on something, and truth be told, I had my phone on speaker sitting on my sewing table talking to somebody while I was working, and I got distracted. And for the first time ever, I hit a pin with my knife. So I had to change the knife because it had a nick. And what happens is it's like your scissors, that if you nick your scissors, it's never going to cut cleanly again. You have to get them resharpened. So when you change your knife, it really varies. I've had sergers that I've had for, say, 3 years and not changed the knife on, and they still cut cleanly. The way to know whether or not you need to change your knife is if it's kind of chunking along and not giving you a clean cut on your fabric, then it means your knife is dull and you need to change it. But, and again, it depends on the kind of fabrics that you use. If you sew on a lot of things like, say, an upholstery weight fabric, polar fleece all the time, things with kind of an unusual finish that are gonna wear out your cutting blade or knife more quickly, then you are going to have to change it more frequently. And most sergers come with one knife, an extra one. They have one already on the machine, but a lot of times in your little accessories, if you look, you'll see another one in there. And again, your handy little instruction manual will tell you how to do that. And it's pretty easy, but if you're not sure how to change your knife, or you're worried that you're not going to do it correctly, just bring it to your dealer and have your technician put one on. It's a real quick thing to do. But there's no hard and fast timeline on that. It just depends on if it's not cutting cleanly. But that gives me a good entree to another tip about cutting fabric. When you're working on any kind of fabric that's heavy, whether it's or lofty, sweatshirt fleece, polar fleece, anything thick, maybe a heavy corduroy or velour or anything like that, always slow down your stitching, because you want to give the knife a chance to cut cleanly. And it's almost the same thing as when you are cutting through a stick of butter. You can do one quick clean cut and have a piece of butter that's very cleanly cut. If you're carving beef, like a roast beef or something like that, you're going back and forth with your knife as you're carving through it. It's denser, it's harder to cut through than butter, and you have to slow down to cut it cleanly. Same thing with your knife on your serger. Give your knife a chance to cut it cleanly by slowing down your stitching speed. So that's just a little tip on that. So if it's not cutting through those super bulky fabrics and it was cutting through your linen or cotton yesterday and doing just fine, slow down and see if that doesn't help.
Great. Thank you. We've got a lot of comments about thank you for so much great information, many light bulb moments. So very appreciative audience here, and we're appreciative of all of you.
Are we ever? I'm delighted. And actually, I you know, as I say, I was really missing doing my workshops and stuff. So I really do thank you again for joining me. And I will be posting when I've got a class formatted and what it's going to be about. But again, if you have suggestions or questions before then, I am very open to taking those and listening to all of those. And I'll be happy to help you out and try to incorporate as much as possible into a workshop. Obviously, you can't get every single thing into one workshop, but that might give us an opportunity to do a number of them. So I will look forward to seeing a lot of you again. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Awesome. So the app that I mentioned before was the Schmetz Needle app.
Oh, yes. Fantastic. And Schmetz Needles makes a wonderful app for your iPhone, your Android phone. It took them, I think, a couple of years to finally get the Android phone app up and working, and it's great for your tablets. So that is something that's super handy to have, whether you're doing work on your serger or your sewing machine, because they have these little booklets. I think they used to call it the ABCs of needles. But if you're somebody who likes to go to sewing retreats or taking a class and you have a question about something, it's just one less thing to have to carry, because it's an app on your phone, and it is chock-a-block full of wonderful information. And Rhonda Pierce is the national spokesperson for Schmetz Needles. She is such a knowledgeable woman about needles. And if you ever get a chance to go to an expo and you see where she's a speaker, take her workshop. It's just probably a lecture, but take it, because you will learn so much about needles. And I know I did from her, and she's just a wealth of knowledge about needles.
Perfect. Okay, so we had a question, how to order the book. If you want to go back to your, and the tote bag pattern. So if you want to open your slideshow back up, I think that would be perfect. And you can order the book and the tote bag pattern, downloadable and in print, on Gail's website, gailpatrice.com, in the store. And
There's Elena. Elena was my model last fall when I finished that up. We're over at Comstock Ferry in Old Weathersfield. But this is the very first one that I did of the tote bag. This was the second one. And I've got other ones. And also on my serger tip clips, you'll see little tips and tricks for doing those great handles on those, the straps. And the ruffling technique on this little ruffle panel as well. I've got a fun little way to do that. But you can go to gailpatrice.com, and I think it's 10% off the downloadable version of the tote bag, Elena.
Yep.
Okay. And on that, just the good news is there's no taping pieces together. You're going to download it, and it's all instructions. So you'll just use your regular printer paper and just download a few pages of instructions on that. And also my book. And if I run out of books from this special, and it is free shipping on the book alone, then I will reorder, and I will alert you that they are on their way. I had to just reorder some the other day, and they came surprisingly fast with, again, the lockdown. The mail has been a little bit slower in some places. The tote bag code is Memorial Day. You see it at the bottom of the screen, all together, capital M, capital D. Save 10% on that downloadable version, and free shipping on the book by itself if you order that. And I will get those out as quickly as possible.
Wonderful. And the serger tip clips are on YouTube. You can subscribe to Gail's channel to stay up to date on that.
Yep. You can go to youtube.com/Gail Yellen, and that'll bring you to the serger tip clips, and subscribe. I'll have a couple of new ones going up, hopefully within the next week. I hope at least one of them will be up. It's being edited right now. So, and those should be helpful for you. And again, you can send in your questions according to what tip clip you're watching. And if you have a question about the technique or anything else, or a comment, I'm happy to look at them. And if you have suggestions for upcoming tip clips, and if you subscribe, that's free. There's no charge to subscribe. So they're fun little quick videos on different things. So are there any other questions or comments or anything anyone wants to say before we sign off?
In the chat.
Yes, in the chat.
I think everyone has been leaving great comments. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, happy Memorial Day weekend to everybody. Stay safe. Enjoy the weekend. I hope if you are able to do any picnics with your family or friends, just stay safe and social distance and follow whatever you feel is good for you and what's been suggested by the medical experts. So because I want to see you all well and healthy at our workshops. So have a great Saturday. Enjoy the rest of the holiday weekend, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.